Hi guys. Okay, so like I said, this is week 5 and it's week 1 on Othello. And yeah, we'll mainly be looking at Othello and Desdemona this week. Like I said in the video as an introduction, in the introductory video, there is quite a lot to say about this play in terms of couples and relationships. So if you feel as if I'm throwing a lot of information at you this week, it's because I am. So don't worry about getting hold of everything. But yeah, take from it what you can and try and engage with it with as much of it as you feel able to. Okay, so Othello. William Shakespeare's Othello was most likely written in 1603. Along with Macbeth, King Lear, and Hamlet. It's one of Shakespeare's 4 most significant works of tragedy. I said that last time in relation to Macbeth as well. And yeah, I'll just stress that this is going to be the last Shakespeare that we're looking at on the course. So if any of you really don't like looking at Shakespeare or find Shakespeare very difficult, then yeah, this will be the last one. So don't worry, I'm not going to keep throwing Shakespeare down your throat. Okay, so some things to bear in mind before we look at the actual structure and plot of Othello is that, as I said in relation to Macbeth way back in week 1, tragedy features a character who undergoes a fall, and this fall has to come about through a combination of their own personality and their circumstances. It can't just be pure bad luck, for example. That wouldn't be tragic. And in order for a person to be a kind of tragic hero or tragic heroine, we have to understand that the way that they behave comes about as a result of who they are as a person. And although we might not agree with what they do, we have to kind of understand that they were not able to behave differently. So something about their personality meant that they had to behave in the way that they behaved, even if we might think that the way that they behaved was crazy. So this I think is interesting in relation to Othello when we think about what the character of Othello actually does and what happens to him in the play. So he moves in quite a conventional tragic manner from being someone who's quite high up, someone who is a very well respected general, to being someone who kills his own wife after he's deceived and lied to by someone whom he considers to be a very close confidant and friend, but who actually hates him. So yeah, it's kind of an open question, and it's a question that you guys should think about as to whether or not we really, in the modern day and age, think of Othello as being a very tragic character at all, or whether we think that he's, kind of a fool or an idiot. So yeah, we can talk about that a bit more if we want to. But yeah, this week we're going to focus on Othello and Desdemona's relationship, okay? A husband and wife relationship, as it is in the play. So, what happens in the play, first of all? Othello opens in Venice, which at the time of the play was one of several Italian city states, so it's not a country. Italy as a country doesn't exist yet. But you have these kind of very powerful, what are called city states. So Venice and Florence would be 2 examples. And Othello is a Moor, which is a 17th century term for someone of Turkish or African origin. And although he does not come from Venice, he has served the Venetian state very well for many years and is one of its most reliable generals. So it's important to be aware right at the start of talking about Othello that Othello himself is someone who is both very much an outsider to Venetian society, but he's also someone who is very well respected within Venetian society, and he's someone who is very highly valued by the Venetian state. And at the opening of the play, Othello has just married Desdemona in secret. And in the first scene, we see Iago, who is the villain of the play, very much so. He's a duplicitous and manipulative lower officer whom Othello considers a close friend, but who privately claims that he quote unquote hates them more, along with Roderigo, who is a kind of pathetic sidekick to Iago and who is an unwanted suitor of Desdemona. And at the start of the play, we see Iago and Roderigo kind of shouting into Brabantio's window, into Desdemona's father's window from the street, in order to tell Brabantio that Othello has married Desdemona, and that he's taken his daughter away. So Iago and Roderigo use a string of racist insults and graphic sexual images in order to enrage Brabantio, who kind of eventually demands that Othello is arrested and brought before the rulers of Venice in order to answer the charge of having used magic in order to woo Desdemona. So Brabantio says that there is no way that Desdemona could have fallen in love with Othello, because of who Othello is, because he's black and because he's not a, because he's an outsider figure. Brabantio insists that Desdemona would not have fallen for Othello were it not for some kind of trick that Othello has done. And after meeting Othello in the street, both him and Brabantio are kind of called before the heads of Venice, and Othello tells his story about how it was that he and Desdemona came to be in love. And we'll look at this passage now. And what Othello says is that he was frequently a guest at Brabantio's house, and that while he was there, Othello would kind of tell stories to both Brabantio and to Desdemona about his life as a soldier. So we can say that Othello is kind of invited over as this kind of exotic guest, and he's invited into the house of a Venetian nobleman in order to kind of entertain him and his daughter, and to tell him kind of fanciful stories about the wonderful and the horrible things that he's seen in his life. And we see this in Act 1, Scene 3 here. And Othello says, when he's defending himself in kind of the courtroom, he says, "Her father loved me, oft invited me, still questioned me the story of my life, from year to year, the battles, sieges, fortunes that I have passed." So Brabantio would invite him and would, ask him to tell stories about everything that he'd been through as a kind of soldier. And Othello says, "I ran it through. So I ran through it. I told it all, even from my boyish days to the very moment that he bade me tell it." So he tells him his entire life story, even up until the point that he actually arrives at Brabantio's house. So he tells the whole story, and he says, "I spake of most disastrous chances, of moving accidents by flood and field." So he talks of catastrophes, of hairbreadth escapes in the imminent deadly breach. So he talks about very near escapes, near death experiences, of being taken by the insolent foe and sold to slavery, of my redemption thence and portents in my traveller's history, wherein of ants and vasts and deserts idle. So he tells all these kind of stories. He tells stories about mythical creatures who Shakespeare's audience would have believed to have been real. So the anthropophagi, men whose heads grow beneath their shoulders. These are kind of fictional creatures who would feature in fictional travel narratives that Elizabethan audiences might read or be familiar with. So Othello presents himself as someone who's been all the way around the world and who has seen things that someone like Brabantio or Desdemona would never ever be able to see, and he's able to spin these events into a kind of story which he uses to entertain the people who are hosting him in Venice. And then we see these things to hear with Desdemona seriously inclined. So Desdemona would kind of listen very intently to what Othello was saying, but still the house affairs would draw her hence, whichever as she could with haste dispatch she'd come again, and with a greedy ear devour up my discourse. So every now and again Desdemona would have to go off and do housework or some kind of business related to her domestic position. But as soon as she could, she would come back again, and she would just want to hear the stories again. With a greedy ear, she would devour up his discourse, which I, observing, Othello says, took once a pliant hour, and found good means to draw from her a prayer of earnest heart, that I would all my pilgrimage dilate, whereof by parcel she had something heard, but not intentively. So he then says that he will tell her the whole story again, and she prays that she begs him to do this. And he says, I did consent, and often did beguile her of her tears, when I did speak of some distressful stroke that my youth suffered. So he tells him these things which have happened to him in his youth, and Desdemona cries. She feels a lot of sympathy and empathy with him. My sympathy, and then he says, my story being done, she gave me for my pains a world of kisses. She swore in faith 'twas strange, 'twas passing strange, 'twas pitiful, 'twas wondrous pitiful. So Desdemona is kind of blown away by the stories that Othello is telling her, and she's never seen anything like this. She's never heard anything like this, and she becomes kind of overwhelmed with sympathy for Othello as he kind of tells these stories. And Othello says, she loved me for the dangers I had passed. So she loves him because of what he's been through, because of his life experiences, as he's told them to her. And Othello says, and I loved her that she did pity them. This is the only witchcraft I have used. So he woos her with stories of how he was and what he's been through. And he says that he begins to love her because she has so much empathy and so much sympathy with him as he appears in these stories, that he finds himself overwhelmed. And that's how those two, first of all, it's how they meet, and also it's how they fall in love. And we'll talk about this as they go along, but right now, again, you want to be paying attention to how it is that the two people here, Othello and Desdemona, they both have a very fixed image of each other in their own minds, and it's something that they almost create for each other. It's almost like Othello creates a story of his own life for Desdemona, and not only does Desdemona fall in love with him because of the story that he creates for her, but he falls in love with her because she affirms and reinforces this kind of image that he gives of himself to her. So yeah, just think about that as we go on. So yeah, Desdemona then comes in after Othello's kind of given this speech. Desdemona comes in, and she confirms that Othello's version of the story is true. And at that point, the kind of rulers of Venice say, look, there's no reason for us to accuse Othello of anything. Yes, he wooed Desdemona, but he wooed Desdemona fairly, and they're in love, so there's no reason for them not to be married. And at that point, Othello is informed that he has to go to Cyprus because the Turkish fleet is on the way, and he, being the great general that he is, needs to defend Venetian interests, and he will lead a kind of army in order to fight the Turkish fleet. And Desdemona says, I have to go with my husband because I'm my husband's wife, and I can't I can't leave him behind. I can't be left behind just because I have to go to war. And we see that speech also in Act 1, Scene 3. And it's worth thinking about the way in which Desdemona has kind of completely has committed herself to kind of completely obeying her husband and to completely following him wherever he goes. So again, in Act 1, Scene 3, this is after we have heard the news that Othello is being sent to Cyprus. Desdemona says, that I love the more to live with him, my downright violence and storm of fortunes may trumpet to the world. So, I shout out to the world that I love the more, who is Othello, and that I will live with him. And she says, my heart's subdued even to the quality of my lord. And quality here means to kind of what he does or to his occupation. So, he's a soldier, so I have to go where soldiers go. So I will follow Othello to Cyprus to do battle, not to do battle with him, but alongside him as he needs to go and fight. And she says, I saw Othello's visage in his mind. So there are a few ways of reading this line. I think it's very important in terms of how we come to think about the Othello and Desdemona's relationship. At this stage, early on in the play, Othello and Desdemona are very much convinced that they're in love with each other and that they know each other very well. And Desdemona says, I saw Othello's visage in his mind, which visage, like the French visage, means face here. So one way of reading what she's saying is that Desdemona saw Othello as he sees himself. So she thinks that she sees him very, very well. But something that we can note here, I think, is that she's saying this. She's not really showing it. So if we compare this line and this sentiment that Desdemona has with the kind of examples that we looked at in terms of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth a couple of weeks ago, in which we're not just told that Lady Macbeth and Macbeth know each other very well, but we see evidence of this. We see evidence of the fact that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have been talking to each other about their most intimate feelings. Remember, Lady Macbeth mentions the dagger that Macbeth had seen, and at no point do we see them talking about it, but we know that Macbeth has told his wife about something that only he knew about. So we see this kind of evidence of this intimacy and this interplay between the two characters. We don't really see this with Othello and Desdemona. We see them talking about the fact that they think it exists, but we don't really see them really confiding in each other. They're very much over the moon about quote unquote being in love, and they claim to know each other, but we don't see that much evidence of it. So yeah, again, bear that in mind as we go through and as we start to kind of dissect this relationship a little bit. It may not be as perfect as it appears. And then after Desdemona has said this, she goes on to say, and I to his honours and his valiant parts did I my soul and fortunes consecrate. So to his success and to his bravery, I have given my very soul and my very fortunes. So she kind of says, I am completely committed to going wherever and to doing whatever my husband does. And she sees this kind of gesture as being what it means to be married to someone. And yeah, again, as the play goes on and as we talk more about their relationship, we might begin to see um, that maybe this idea is more performative and more a kind of extreme choice about what it means to be in love than it is a kind of real piece of evidence for Othello and Desdemona having a really, especially intimate relationship. But okay, back to what we're talking about. So they go to Cyprus. Everyone exits. This is the end of Act One, and then and then Iago has a speech in which he says that he has a monstrous plan in all which he will use to kind of get revenge on Othello. Um, there's a long critical debate about why Iago does what he does, and it's never really been answered. We'll talk about that more next week when we talk about Othello and Iago's relationship. Okay, so the characters arrive in Cyprus. They are told that the entire Turkish fleet has been destroyed by a storm, which means that the war is off, basically. Then there's not going to be any battle. And Othello and Desdemona, everyone's very happy, and Othello and Desdemona kind of greet each other with these great words of affection and love. We see that in Act 1, Scene 2, where Othello says they kind of enter in. I'll put the video clip for this on eCampus as well. And Othello says, "It gives me wonder, great as my content, to see you here before me, oh, my soul's joy. If after every tempest comes such calms, may the wind blow till they have wakened death." So if I saw you after every storm, then may we have the worst storm imaginable, just so that I can get to see you again afterwards. 'Twere now to be most happy, for I fear my soul hath her content so absolute, that not another comfort like to this succeeds in unknown fate. So he says, I'm so happy now that part of me is worried that I will never be able to be this happy again. And remember, they've only been separated for a couple of days, in fact, not even that, for maybe a day. So this is very loving. This is, very earnest, but it's also quite exaggerated, maybe. And there's an irony here too, because this will actually be the most happy that Othello feels. This day will be the last day that he's ever able to truly trust Desdemona, or to find any happiness in his relationship with her. And then Desdemona says, "The heavens forbid, but that our loves and comfort should increase even as our days do grow." So she kind of says, well, let's hope that we just keep on getting happier the more and more time that we spend together. And again, there's an irony here, because we know that this is not going to be the case, that they will not be happier than they are at this point, more or less. And Iago gives a kind of aside at this point and says that he'll set down the pegs that make this music. So he's going to mess things up, basically, and he's going to make them all very unhappy. Iago kind of has these villainous asides throughout the play in which he lets the audience know that he's that he is a villain, and that he's going to make good things bad, which is what he proceeds to do. But again, we're not really focusing on that this time. Okay, so from this point on, as I've said, Iago begins to enact his plan in order to get revenge on Othello and on Cassio, who is the young person whom Othello has chosen to promote instead of Iago. And again, we can go into this in a bit more detail next week, but there is a lot of critical debate about what precisely Iago's motivations are, whether they make any sense at all, why he does what he does, whether he's consumed by a racist hatred of Othello, whether he's just kind of pure evil, whether he's a psychopath, whether he just does it for kicks. We'll talk about that more next week when we look at Othello and Iago's relationship. But just briefly to get to get to the end of the play. So Iago begins by getting Cassio drunk, and then by encouraging him to fight. After which Othello fires Cassio, says, you're not, you don't have the right temperament to be a soldier, you don't have the right personality, so you can't be an officer anymore. And then after this, Iago begins to convince Othello, quite slowly at first, but then quite quickly, that Desdemona has been unfaithful to him with Cassio. And he does this by planting the idea that Desdemona has been sleeping with Cassio in Othello's imagination, at the same time that he persuades Cassio to ask Desdemona to appeal to Othello to get him kind of reinstated. So we'll see this a little bit at 3 Scene 3. When Othello, when Desdemona kind of comes to Othello and says, "Why, your Lieutenant Cassio, good my lord, if I have any grace or power to move you, his present reconciliation take." So, Desdemona says, "Look, if I have any grace or power to move you, husband, if I can influence you in any way, you need to forgive Cassio, and you need to reinstate him. He's sorry for what he did last night, and he only wants to be your lieutenant." And Othello says, "Was that him you were just talking to?" And Desdemona says, "Yes." And then Othello says, "Not now, come to me at a different time." So again, we're seeing a kind of different relationship to the relationship that we saw between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth here. It's quite, although Desdemona really speaks to her husband and really tries to get his attention, it's not as intimate as Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. She doesn't really have that much influence over him. She tries to persuade him, but he kind of says, "Look, not now, I've got other things to do." At another point, she says, "I meet the captains at the citadel." And then she just keeps on persuading him, or trying to. Says, "Why then, tomorrow night, or Tuesday morn, on Tuesday noon, or night, on Wednesday morn, I prithee name the time, but let it not exceed 3 days. In faith, he's penitent. He is Cassio." So he's sorry, he's really sorry. "And yet his trespass in our common reason, save that they say the wars must make examples out of their best, is not almost a fault to incur a private check." So, he didn't do anything that bad. He messed up, but you should forgive him. And she keeps on saying, and then at one point she even says, "Look, Cassio came a wooing with you, and he actually persuaded me of your good character, so Cassio is one of the reasons that we got together." And then Othello says, "Prithee, no more, let him come when he will, I will deny thee nothing." So he says, Othello kind of says, "Okay, then, yeah, I'll listen to him. I will deny thee nothing. So, I love you, I'm not going to deny you anything." But again, she just kind of nags him. She doesn't really persuade him. She doesn't really speak to his soul. Like, he likes her because she's a nice person, and because she's his wife. But we don't get a sense that these guys really understand each other on a very deep emotional level. They're in love, and they're in love with a certain idea of each other. But in some ways, it is going to be this idea of each other that Iago is going to be able to exploit. And we know at this point that Iago is going to use Desdemona's kind of pleading on behalf of Cassio against both Cassio and Othello and Desdemona, in order to persuade Othello that Desdemona is being unfaithful. But again, we'll go into that more next week. And then by the end of Act 3, Scene 3, Othello has moved from saying what he says at the start, that he is so in love with Desdemona that he can think of no greater happiness, to saying that he's going to kill her in her bed. And Iago brings this about by manipulating him in ways that we'll look at next week. But sure enough, at the end of Act 5, Othello does kill Desdemona. He's found out. He realizes that the whole thing was manipulated by Iago, that he was lied to, and that he was kind of played by Iago. And then he gives a final speech, and then he kills himself. So, one overriding question for how we think about all of this is, why does it happen? One of the major questions for the play is why Othello believes Iago, and why it is that, having believed him, he then goes on to kill Desdemona. So there are two possible answers to this question on the level of Iago and Othello's relationship. One of which is that he's a master manipulator, and the other of which is that Othello is a credulous fool, which is a term that Iago uses. And it just means that he's gullible, that he believes people when they talk to him and when they tell him things. And we can look at that next week. But for this week to end, we can just focus a bit on whether or not there's anything in Othello and Desdemona's relationship, as we've been talking about it, which lends itself to this kind of manipulation. Would this kind of manipulation have been possible if a different kind of relationship existed between Othello and Desdemona? So we'll just run through these points quite quickly. So we see at the start of the play that they have not known each other for very long, and we also see the way in which narrative plays a key role in the story of their marriage, and this is something that I want you to think about quite a lot. And yeah, Othello, as we looked at, this kind of speech that Othello gives is all about narrative. It's all about him creating a life story out of real events, but nonetheless creating it for Othello and Brabantio, and for Desdemona and Brabantio, sorry, and Desdemona believing him and affirming that life story. And as we said, she's described as consuming the image of himself that Othello creates quite greedily. And this fact causes Othello to fall in love with her, as she is able, through pity, to affirm the version of Othello that he creates for her. And then we can say, look, at no point do we see, not many points do we see any real evidence that these two really know each other past the kind of idealized images that they have of each other. They haven't spent much time together. Some critics think that actually Othello and Desdemona, the way that the temporality of the play works, some critics argue that they never actually, quote unquote, consummate their marriage. So they never get to spend a night together because they're kind of continually being interrupted. So they may not even achieve that kind of level of intimacy which one would associate with a wedding night. Certainly for Shakespeare's audience, at least. And we see in Act 4 and Act 5, when they do talk to each other, that they kind of talk at cross purposes. Othello never just sits down and asks Desdemona what she's been doing. He's becomes fixated on an image of her and on the idea of her being unfaithful, and this proceeds to influence and to mediate every kind of possible every interaction that he has with her, following Act 3, Scene 3, which is the scene in the play in which Iago really turns Othello against Desdemona. And we can see this in Act 3, Scene 4, in which Othello is now obsessed with the idea of Desdemona's infidelity, because of the way that Iago has manipulated him. And he becomes particularly obsessed with a handkerchief which Iago has stolen but which Iago tells Othello that he's seen Cassio holding. And this handkerchief was a present that Othello gave to Desdemona early on in their marriage. And the fact that Desdemona can't produce it when Othello asks for it becomes kind of evidence of her absolute guilt in his eyes, which the audience and Iago knows is crazy because it's just a handkerchief and Iago's stolen it anyway. But Othello is manipulated in such a way that even something as small as this becomes something which is powerful enough to completely change his mind about his wife. So we see them in Act 3, Scene 4. Othello enters and says, well, my good lady, and then he has an aside to the audience where he says, oh, hardness to dissemble. And what this means is, oh, how difficult it is to get to the bottom of this, to understand this, to really see into who Desdemona is. Because now he's suspicious of her. And one of the ironies that the audience is aware of at this point is that there is nothing to dissemble. There's nothing to know. Sorry. She hasn't done anything. There's nothing to worry about here. But Othello has become obsessed with the idea that she is not who she appears to be. And because of that, he becomes obsessed with the idea that her external characteristics reveal something about her that he can't know and that he can't understand. So he starts looking for clues about who she really is as a person, even though we, the audience, and Iago and Desdemona know that she's not hiding anything. There's nothing to look for. But Othello says, give me your hand. This hand is moist, my lady. Notice how distant, notice how formal their conversation appears at this point. You know, a few scenes ago, they were kind of making out in the courtyard and they were kissing and they were saying that they could never be more happy than they are now. Othello was saying that anyway. And Desdemona says that yet hath felt no age, nor known nor sorrow. So she's starting to worry a little bit here. And Othello says, this argues fruitfulness and a liberal heart. So he says, look, your hand is moist. This is a sign that you are fertile, but also that your heart is liberal. And by liberal here, it means free, which means changeable. This argues that actually your feelings might change quickly and that you might not stand by what you say, and you might well change your mind about things. For here's a young and sweating devil here that commonly rebels. So here is a kind of hand that goes against order and that can't be trusted. And then Desdemona tries to kind of bring him round and says, yeah, you could say that because it was a hand that gave away my heart. So, this kind of rebellious nature that I have made me fall in love with you. And then Desdemona doesn't understand what's going on, doesn't understand why her husband is behaving in this way, but remembers her promise to Cassio and says, I have sent to bid Cassio come speak with you. At which point Othello kind of falls into a fit and says, what about that handkerchief? And we have the speech about the handkerchief in which Othello, he's kind of fixated on this kind of object, which he thinks Desdemona has given to Cassio. And he tells the story about it. He says, that handkerchief did an Egyptian to my mother give. She was a charmer and could almost read the thoughts of people. She told her while she kept it 'twould make her amiable and subdue my father entirely to her love. But if she lost it, or made a gift of it, my father's eyes should hold her loathed, and her spirit should hunt after new fancies. So he says, look, this handkerchief was given to my mother by an Egyptian sorceress, and it had magic in it, and this woman who gave it to my mother told her that as long as she kept hold of it, then my father would stay in love with her. But at the same time, if she ever lost it, then my father would fall out of love with her. And at this stage, the audience is watching Othello go through this kind of obsessive, jealous neurosis, and he's obsessing about a piece of cloth that he's given to his wife, and he's almost warning her that he thinks that he knows that something is very deeply wrong, but he can't just come out and ask her. He can't just come out and have an honest conversation with Desdemona about how he's feeling or about what Iago has said. And again, it's the fact that he can't do this, and it's the fact that their relationship won't allow them to just kind of speak to each other normally, that perhaps enables Iago to manipulate the kind of situation in the way that he is able to. And one of the deep ironies of this scene is that Emilia, who we'll talk more about next week in terms of her relationship to Desdemona, she is the person who has stolen the handkerchief and given it to Iago. So she knows all Othello has to do is just say, look, did you give that handkerchief to Cassio? And the problem would be solved. But he doesn't do that because he doesn't confide in his wife, because he doesn't have that kind of intimate relationship with his wife. This is going to lead to their destruction, as we're going to see. So, at this point, Desdemona does appear to be afraid, and she confides in Emilia, who is her friend and her servant, and who will talk about their relationship next week, that she actually doesn't know her husband. She thought she did. She thought that they understood each other, but she's coming to realize that she doesn't know him at all. Okay, and then if we fast forward to Act 5, Othello is now convinced that he has to kill Desdemona, which he's going to do. And at the start of Act 5, Scene 2, which is the scene in which he does kill Desdemona, and it's the final scene of the play, we see him giving a speech as he kind of enters her bedchamber. And he kind of looks down on her and says, it is the cause of my soul. And by this, he means the reason or the ground for action. You can see this in the annotations as well. So if you do, I find the annotations for this text do help, so definitely use them. But he says, look, this idea that he has to kill her is everything for him. It's the deepest part of his soul. But at the same time, he's also full of regret and pain at what he's going to do. And he says, I'll not shed her blood, nor scar that whiter skin of hers than snow, and smooth as monumental alabaster. So alabaster is marble. It's a kind of white, igneous rock that tombs are made out of, and that beautiful statues that you see on tombs are made out of. So at the same time that he's full of regret for what he's doing, Othello is also still fixated on a certain idea of Desdemona. He doesn't see her as a person. He sees her as someone who's too perfect to be true, and someone who, I think you can make an argument that one of the reasons that he feels that he has to kill her is because he can't stand the idea that this image that he has of her is broken or polluted. So he kind of makes her a martyr to her own self, and it's because of this that he doesn't listen to her. He doesn't care to ask her. He's already made up his mind that she's guilty, and that whatever she says will have no kind of effect on him. So again, I think we can say that we see the kind of influence that stories and narratives and the ideas that we have of people um, influence the way that we behave toward them, even to the extent that Othello is willing to kill Desdemona, either to protect the idea that he has of her or that he had of her, or because Iago kind of destroying that idea by making Othello jealous um, breaks him so completely that he becomes obsessed, and the only thing that he can do is to think to kill her. So the final speech we're going to look at is Othello's final speech in the play, which is again at the end of Act 5, Scene 2. And so, to give you a brief rundown, Othello kills Desdemona. It's harrowing. It's not a pleasant scene at all. Emilia immediately finds out, and Emilia, in some ways, is the most sympathetic, actually, and certainly the bravest character in the play. And she just tells Othello that he's an idiot. Realizes very quickly what's gone on with Iago and the way that Iago has manipulated Othello, and then calls everyone in and says, look, Othello is a fool and he's killed Desdemona. And at that point, Othello realizes that he's been manipulated. Iago is held captive. So is Othello. Othello is about to be led away to answer for his crime. His reputation is ruined. It's destroyed. And some of the characters may have some sympathy for him, but they certainly don't think that what he did was right. And he's about to be kind of disgraced before the entire Venetian authorities for what he's done. And just before he's going to be led away, he gives a kind of speech and says, soft you, a word or two before you go. I have done the state some service and they know it. No more of that. I pray you in your letters, when you shall these unlucky deeds relate, speak of me as I am, nothing extenuate, nor set down aught in malice. So he kind of says, look, when you're going to tell people about what happened, don't leave anything out, but at the same time, don't write anything out of malice, out of anger, or out of hatred, but just talk about me honestly. And then he says, if you do that, then you must speak of one that loved not wisely, but too well. There's critical debate about what this means, what the idea of loving not wisely, but too well might mean. I think that if we think about it in terms of what we've spoken about so far, about Othello and Desdemona's relationship, then one of the things we can think about is this idea that Othello and Desdemona too, to an extent, it's not that they're too much in love, but that they see each other as being too perfect. They're in love with the idea of each other, which they both kind of create for each other. And it's rather than this forming a kind of sustainable model for a relationship, actually what this does is it allows them to be very happy for a time, but as soon as it's challenged, as soon as these idealized images that Othello and Desdemona have of each other is challenged, the whole thing falls apart. They can't talk to each other. Othello can't talk to Desdemona. They don't have any kind of shared emotional connection, actually. which will allow them to work through any problems that they have, any jealousy that they might have. Um, Obviously, none of this justifies Othello's actions, and there's an open question as to how sympathetic we feel to Othello, even when he's saying this. T.S. Eliot, the famous American critic and poet, said that he was very unimpressed with Othello's final speech, and that he just thought that he was trying to cheer himself up. And the way that he tries to cheer himself up, if we take this line, is by telling another story. So he tells a story about how once, when he was in Aleppo in the Middle East, he got into a fight with a Turk, so with a non-Christian, with a Venetian, and that this Turk was beating up a Venetian and had traduced the state, so had insulted the state, and that Othello smote him and killed him. So when he kind of tells this final story, which he tells just before he stabs himself, Othello kind of executes himself for his own crime. And he, in this way, you can argue that he again uses a story, uses a narrative to try to exonerate himself and to try to make himself appear to be honorable again, in spite of what he's done. And in spite of how easily he was manipulated by Iago, and in spite of the fact that, he's just killed his wife, which is not something that we generally think of as being very heroic behavior. So again, those are Othello's final words in the play. And how we think about them really has an effect on how we think about Othello as a character, whether he's someone who ultimately is unable to face the consequences of what he's done, is unable to accept that what he's done was terrible and was stupid. Emilia tells him that he was stupid to do it, not just that he's brutal or that he's merciless, but that he's dumb. And Othello at this point is very much fixated on the idea that what he was doing was just and was necessary. And we know that that isn't the case at all. Okay, guys, so like I said, I know that this was long and it was longer than usual, but I hope that you've got some kind of a sense of some of the kind of relationship dynamics which make Othello interesting to talk about in terms of couples and duos, and also in terms of the relationships between men and women in general. Femicide is not something, sadly, which ended in the 17th century. So yeah, in some ways this is a play about domestic violence, and it's a play about the psychology of domestic violence, I think. And just the final point that we have, or the second penultimate point that we have, second to last point we have, is that while Othello is more well known for its presentation of race, and we'll talk about that again next week in terms of Othello and Iago's relationship, it's also a play about men's attitudes towards women and about the destructive and the insane extremes towards which these relationships and these attitudes might lead, or may lead, and do lead in some situations, and it's really a question for the play in terms of how much we can talk about Othello and Desdemona's relationship without either falsely making Desdemona responsible for what happens to her, but also without underestimating the extent to which this kind of relationship is dysfunctional. So, tasks for this week. just read through the extracts that I've uploaded and watch the videos as usual, and think about the kind of aspects of Othello and Desdemona's relationship that I've tried to highlight and talk about, and answer just these questions that I've written here. So, do you yourself recognize the kind of relationship that we've talked about here? A kind of relationship in which two people idolize each other without really establishing any kind of real intimacy. Do you recognize that either from your own life or from other people's lives that you know, or even from other works of literature? Is a relationship like this, as we've discussed it here, is this kind of relationship always doomed to failure? Will it always be that at some point the kind of infatuation that Othello and Desdemona have for each other, will this always result in a breakup, essentially? Obviously, we shouldn't say it will always result in what happens to Othello and Desdemona, or what Othello does to Desdemona, but it might always have a kind of finitude to that kind of relationship. And final question, would you respond to Othello at this point as a tragic character? And remember that for a character to be tragic, as I said right at the start, we have to be able to understand their thought processes. And to some degree, we have to be able to relate to what they feel and what they do. Some people don't think Othello is at all relatable. And I think that he feels less relatable, and for that reason, less tragic, the older the play gets. I think this play is still very interesting and still a very brilliant play. But the status of Othello as someone who is sympathetic and who we can really understand as being essentially good or essentially wise, but manipulated into doing something terrible, I think that becomes harder and harder to maintain. And like I say, the play becomes more and more a question or a investigation of the destructive aspect of men's relationship to women, especially groups of men, how they discuss women, how they view women, and less the kind of story of this great tragic hero. But, you guys can make up your own minds about that too. And finally, I would say think about one of the scene extracts that I've uploaded. Think about how you would stage it if you were putting on your own production of the play. Think about how you might make use of lighting, set, and different kinds of acting in order to communicate some of the ideas that we've spoken about here. So yeah, like I always say, if you want to send me this work, you can do, and I'd be happy to look over it for you. But you don't have to, and it won't be graded. It'll just be there for you so that you can stay engaged with the course, really. So it's up to you if you want to do it or not. And yeah, guys, so if you're watching this before Monday, then I will hopefully speak to you on Monday. If you're watching it on Monday or after Monday, then I hope that you have a good week. As always, email me with any questions or difficulties that you guys are having. And yeah, I know that this was a lot for this week. I don't expect you to read all the extracts that I've given you in very fine detail. And if you found things difficult to follow, if you found some of the things that I was saying to not be very clear, then talk to me about it, either in the catch-up meeting or over email, and I'll do my best to try and explain things for you. I know this was a big recording today, but there's a lot to say about this play, and I think there's a lot that we can be interested in as we continue to think about different kinds of interpersonal relationship. Okay, guys, so ciao. See you soon.